Not everything that's broken can be fixed with money. He had a mansion, top-tier professionals, and the resources any desperate father would dream of. But none of it made his son react. Then, one ordinary day, he came home early and found something that stopped his world. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Eduardo Ferraz's mansion, perched high in a gated community in São Paulo, was as silent as a hospital. After visiting ours, every room was immaculate, decorated with imported pieces, but it lacked something essential: life. Lucas, his only son, just 9 years old, spent his days in a wheelchair, always staring into space, as if trapped in a time no one else could access. 2 years prior, a brutal car accident had claimed the life of Mariana, Eduardo's wife, and left Lucas paralyzed from the neck down. Since then, the boy hadn't spoken a single word. His father, unable to cope with his own grief and guilt, had thrown himself into work, letting doctors, therapists, and nurses fill the space that should have been his. But nothing worked. Despite all the resources money could buy, Lucas remained unresponsive. The specialists said he was in a state of extreme psychological withdrawal, an emotional defense mechanism. Eduardo listened to it all with cold detachment, jotted down names, paid the bills, and returned to his meetings. The staff avoided long conversations. The house operated like a corporation: schedules, reports, protocols. Lucas received technical care, and Eduardo prided himself on the structure he had built. But when he came home at night and met his son's vacant stare, he felt a deep failure he didn't know how to fix. It was in this setting a little over a month ago that Livia Mendez, the new caregiver, arrived. A young nursing graduate from the countryside of Paraná. She didn't seem intimidated by the cold mansion. Her steps were light, her voice was calm, and, unlike everyone else, she didn't treat Lucas like a patient. She treated him like a boy, and this, though still silent, was beginning to make a difference. But Eduardo didn't know it yet. Not until that day, not until that precise moment when something would finally break the silence. Eduardo Ferraz woke up every day before sunrise. He drank his black coffee in silence, reviewed emails on his phone with a furrowed brow, and walked with firm steps to the garage. The driver would be waiting, never speaking. It had been this way for 2 years. No morning small talk, no lingering glances, just the cold, precise routine of a man who had chosen to hide behind efficiency. In the back of the car, between one business call and the next, Eduardo would allow himself to open the house cameras and watch his son for a few seconds. The monitor showed Lucas in the physical therapy room, motionless in his chair, surrounded by stimuli that seemed to have no effect. Sometimes he'd watch for 3 minutes or 4 until something inside him felt a pang of discomfort. Then he'd turn it off, telling himself there was no time for it. In the first few months after the accident, Eduardo had spent a fortune trying to save what was left of his son. He hired neuroscientists from Germany, physical rehabilitation therapists from Sweden, and renowned child psychologists from Boston. He paid for experimental protocols, brain stimulation sessions, robotic physical therapy, and even installed a private medical center at home with state-of-the-art equipment. He demanded they try everything: oxygenation, biofeedback, virtual reality. Each new technology promised to open a crack in Lucas's mind, but nothing happened. With every failed attempt, Eduardo grew harder. He started treating the professionals as employees who weren't delivering results, demanding replacements, reports, and metrics of progress. Doctors came and went. Nurses lasted weeks. Some cried discreetly as they said goodbye to the boy. He no longer cried. Deep down, something in him knew it wasn't just about science or medicine, but he avoided thinking about it. Thinking required feeling, and feeling was dangerous, because whenever he let himself remember Mariana's face in that hospital, the sound of her heart monitor flatlining, or Lucas's terrified look in the back seat that day, everything inside him would collapse. So he chose not to remember. He focused on business. The real estate market demanded focus. There were mergers to close, meetings in London, clients in Dubai. Meanwhile, the house ran like a well-oiled machine. Shifts of nurses, scheduled physical therapists, printed reports. Eduardo read them all, scribbled notes, and never failed to pay for any treatment, no matter how expensive. The problem was, Lucas remained the same, and he didn't know what to do about it. Livia Mendez had been hired almost as a last resort. The previous nurse had quit after carefully suggesting that perhaps the boy needed something more than just physical stimulation. Eduardo hadn't responded, simply signed the paperwork and asked the agency for someone with experience and credentials. Livia came with good references, but without fancy degrees. A simple woman from Londrina, she had worked in hospitals and with children with various disabilities. She also knew how to stay calm and listen. In the first few days, Eduardo ignored her. He observed her through reports and cameras, noting that she spent more time with the boy than expected, not just on exercises, but reading aloud, playing soft music and asking questions, even without answers. Once, he caught her applying lotion to Lucas's hands while talking about the scent of lavender and the childhood memories it could bring back. He thought it was a waste of time, but for some reason didn't stop her. Livia didn't seem to be intimidated. Even with the house's impersonal atmosphere and the suspicious looks from other staff, she maintained her rhythm. She didn't treat Lucas like a statistic or a life mission. She was just there, with a quiet presence. And perhaps that's what was beginning to bother Eduardo, little by little. One night, he returned early from a trip and passed Lucas's room. Standing in the doorway unseen, Livia was sitting on the floor, playing soft music on her phone while narrating a children's story in an almost hypnotic tone. Lucas's eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. Eduardo stood there for a few minutes until he felt ridiculous for spying on something so simple. He went to his office and turned on his computer, but he couldn't concentrate. For the first time in a long time, he couldn't close a spreadsheet. The next morning, he asked the housekeeper for a summary of Livia's work. He wanted to know her hours, behavior, and punctuality. He found no flaws, but there was something about this woman he didn't understand. It wasn't a technique, not therapy. It was something else, and it unnerved him. He thought about replacing her, afraid of creating expectations. He had been fooled before, thinking a slight blink of the eye was a sign, that a tremor in the fingers was a response, and it was never anything. He didn't want to go through that again. Still, he postponed any decision. Livia, for her part, didn't seem to know she was being watched. She continued to follow her instincts, talking to Lucas as if he were someone who was still whole on the inside. And maybe, just maybe, he was. Slowly, without Eduardo admitting it, something in the house was beginning to stir. It was still almost imperceptible, but it was real. And everything was about to change. Livia Mendez arrived at the mansion on a rainy Monday afternoon. The driver picked her up at the main gate, and during the ride to the house, she couldn't take her eyes off the large concrete and glass building, which looked more like a five-star hospital than a home. She carried only a small suitcase, a binder with notes on Lucas, and an umbrella with a bent handle. When she got out of the car, she was greeted by the housekeeper, a serious woman named Donna Marta, who spoke in a purely formal manner, without a single smile. As she walked down the long entrance hall, Livia noticed a faint scent of disinfectant and artificial lavender. Nothing felt welcoming, not the modern paintings on the walls, not the expensive designer furniture, not the silence. She didn't comment, but realized that the house didn't breathe. It was as if it had been anesthetized. On the fourth floor, she was shown the room where she would stay. It had a single bed, a built-in closet, and a window overlooking the winter garden. It was bigger than the apartment she had grown up in, with her parents and two siblings in Londrina. The next day at 7 a.m. sharp, she put on the white lab coat she had brought from her old clinic and went to meet Lucas. She entered the room with light steps, observing before she acted. The boy was near the window, turned to face. Outside, his eyes fixed on a point no one could identify. His wheelchair was state-of-the-art, adjustable, with cervical support and electronic controls, but the boy in it seemed too small for so much equipment. Livia approached him calmly and knelt beside him, trying to be at his eye level. She didn't say, "Hi, how are you?" because she knew such questions didn't work. She simply introduced herself softly. She said her name, where she was from, that she liked music, and that she wasn't there to make him better, but to keep him company. Lucas didn't react or blink. Still, she remained sitting there for several minutes without touching anything, just breathing with him. For the first few days, she followed this pattern. She read children's books aloud, even without a response. She played soft Tom Jobim songs on her phone, commented on the weather, and sometimes told a funny story from her childhood. Other times, she just sat there in silence, as if she knew that silence also communicates. She watched the small movements of Lucas's eyes, trying to identify patterns, never forcing contact. When she saw him withdraw, she would pull back too. The other staff in the house watched her from a distance. Donna Marta warned her not to get her hopes up, that many nurses had left there with broken hearts. Livia replied that she didn't expect anything, that she just wanted to be present. Marta frowned as if she didn't understand this logic, and walked away. Since the accident, no. One had emotionally settled into that house. People came to work, fulfill their duties, follow protocols, and leave. Eduardo barely spoke to her. In the first few days, the only direct contact was about schedules and reports. He didn't ask how his son was doing, only if the procedures were being followed. Livia responded with firmness, but didn't let his cold tone affect her. She knew she was dealing with a broken man, and the kind of pain he carried didn't allow for pleasantries. After the first week, she began to introduce gentle touches into Lucas's routines. She'd apply lotion to his hands, massage his shoulders, and carefully comb his hair, sometimes whispering kind words close to his ear. Other times, she would just sit there holding his hand. On the 10th day, she noticed that the boy's eyes followed her when she moved around the room. She didn't smile or get overly emotional. She just noted it, holding on to that moment with the same care one holds a small flame in a strong wind. One afternoon, when it was raining outside, she put on some slow instrumental music and began to gently move the wheelchair with her hands in an almost dancing rhythm. She didn't do anything abrupt, just lightly followed the melody. Lucas didn't laugh or cry, but his eyes shone in a different way. Livia stopped immediately, afraid of intruding on some memory, but Lucas blinked slowly as if to say, "You can continue." That night, sitting on her room's balcony, she looked at the cloudy sky and thought of her mother, who used to say that some pains only open up to those who know how to stay quiet beside them. In that house, everything was contained. Every room held an absence, but there was a dormant strength inside, something that could still be reached. And maybe, just maybe, Lucas would be the one to find his way back first. Livia knew it wouldn't be fast, but she also knew that something was already changing, still formless, still nameless, but alive. During the 3rd week of her work, Livia woke up with a premonition. It wasn't a logical thought, but a persistent feeling, as if something was about to change. She put on her light linen blouse, tied her hair in a low bun, and went to Lucas's room earlier than usual. When she entered, the boy was still sleeping. The morning light streamed through the curtains in soft stripes, painting the floor with a silent gold. Livia approached the chair carefully, making no noise. She just sat in a nearby armchair and waited. She didn't want to wake him. She just wanted to be there when he did. A little later, Lucas slowly opened his eyes. They seemed more vivid, as if they were less distant from reality. They looked at each other for a few seconds without a word. Livia just smiled with her eyes and said softly, "Good morning." He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. That day, during the daily care session, she decided to do something different. They were alone in the room, and Lucas seemed calm. Livia took out her phone and played some gentle instrumental music, the kind she used to help children fall asleep when she worked in the pediatric ward. She sat across from him and began to talk about simple things: the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of rain on the roof of her house in Londrina, and playing with her siblings in their red clay backyard. She spoke as if she were talking to an old friend. As she narrated, Lucas's eyes began to move subtly. For the first time since she had arrived, he wasn't holding a lost gaze. He followed the gestures of her hands, watched when she stood up and sat down again. There was one moment when she stumbled over her words and let out a light laugh. Lucas blinked twice, faster than normal. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but she felt something different in that gesture. She continued speaking as if nothing had happened, but her chest tightened with a hope she fought to keep from becoming an expectation. In the following days, she started paying more attention to the details. Lucas seemed to recognize her voice. When another nurse tried to perform some technical care, he remained inert. But with her, there was a slight tension in his fingers, a micro movement at the corner of his mouth, and a more sustained focus in his eyes. Livia didn't comment to anyone. She treasured every tiny reaction like precious stones hidden in her pocket. On one of the coldest afternoons that month, she brought a small, old-fashioned wind-up music box into the room. It was a gift from her grandmother that she had never used there, afraid it would seem inappropriate. But that day, something inside her said it was the right time. She carefully turned the key, and the sweet metallic sound of a lullaby began to fill the room. Lucas slowly turned his head toward the sound, not with force or obviously, but enough for her to know that he was listening. She held back her emotions and approached. She sat on the floor near the chair and began to sing, softly along with the melody. She hadn't rehearsed. She just let the music flow with a simple, clear voice, as if singing to someone who deserved gentleness. And there, in the middle of that old song, Lucas let out a sound. It wasn't a word, or even a syllable. It was something between a sigh and a puff of air, but it was spontaneous, and it came from him. Livia stopped singing instantly, trying to understand if she had heard correctly. Lucas was looking at her with an expression that wasn't of pain or tiredness. It was almost curiosity. She didn't ask any questions. She just said softly, "I heard you, Lucas. If you want to do it again, I'm here." He didn't repeat it, but that day, after she left the room, he kept looking at the door for longer than usual. And that night, when Eduardo discreetly glanced through the crack in the door, he noticed his son was awake, his eyes more vibrant, as if something inside him had been lit. He didn't say anything, didn't comment to anyone, but the image stayed with him for hours. The next day, Livia entered the room and saw Lucas with his eyes toward the window. The sky was clear, and two birds were perched on the edge of the roof. She commented in a low voice, "They always show up together. I think they're siblings." Lucas turned his head a millimeter in the direction of her voice. That was enough. She didn't celebrate, didn't write it in a report. She just approached, and silently stood beside him for long minutes, looking outside, sharing that moment that seemed so simple on the surface, but was inside a small miracle. Something had changed, something small but real, and she knew it was only the beginning. Eduardo woke up with the feeling that something in the house was different. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The staff seemed less tense. The atmosphere, once dry and automatic, now held a light energy, as if the mansion, silent for 2 years, was slowly beginning to breathe again. He couldn't say exactly why, but he suspected it had to do with Livia's presence. Drinking his coffee on the upstairs balcony, he watched the movements inside the house from a distance. He saw Livia pushing Lucas's wheelchair onto the lower-level balcony, the two of them covered with a blanket. She pointed to something in the garden, spoke with a gentle tone, and Lucas, though immobile, seemed present. There was no explosive reaction, no words spoken, but the boy was there, attentive, in a way he couldn't remember seeing him. Eduardo was not a man who believed in miracles, never was. He always trusted data more than intuition, diagnoses more than feelings. The small changes he had been noticing in Lucas in recent weeks bothered him. He wondered if this was real or just another illusion. He had been mistaken before, confusing involuntary reflexes with progress, allowing himself to feel hope. And the fall afterward was always more profound. Now he didn't want to fall again. He called the housekeeper and asked her to observe Livia more closely. He wanted to know exactly what she did during the day, who she talked to, and how she conducted the care. Donna Marta, loyal and discreet, replied that Livia followed all the schedules, was extremely careful, and seemed to treat the boy with great respect. She added that the house felt lighter and that even Lucas seemed more awake. Eduardo simply nodded without comment. That same afternoon, he reviewed footage from the camera discreetly, installed in Lucas's room, a resource he rarely used but which now seemed necessary. He fast-forwarded through some clips, watching Livia enter, adjust the pillows, change the sheets gently, and apply moisturizer to the boy's hands with slow touches. Then she would hum something almost inaudible. Lucas watched her the entire time. Eduardo advanced the video and stopped at a scene where she brought the small music box close to the bed. She turned the key, the music began, and Lucas's eyes lit up. There was no clear movement, but there was life. That affected him more than he wanted to admit. He turned off the video and walked away from the desk. He went to the living room, sat on the sofa, and stared into space for several minutes. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard music in the house. Mariana was the one who used to fill the rooms with sound, always playing something soft at the end of the day while she played with Lucas. After the accident, silence became a kind of unspoken rule. Music reminded him of the past, and the past hurt. At dinner, he crossed paths with Livia in the hallway. She greeted him with a slight smile and calm eyes. He responded with a brief nod. He wanted to ask her something but couldn't find the right words. He walked past her, but her image lingered in his mind. There was something about that woman that unsettled him. She wasn't bold or flattering. She was firm without being harsh, sweet without being submissive, and most importantly, she didn't seem to be trying to prove anything. She just did her job with presence and dignity. The next morning, he found one of the routine reports left on his desk. He carefully read the clinical records, but this time something caught his attention more than the charts, a comment Livia had written by hand at the bottom of the page. Today, Lucas maintained direct eye contact for 6 minutes while listening to the song. No intervention, just presence. Eduardo read it 3 times. It wasn't a medical observation. It was a human one, and it disconcerted him. Throughout the day, he was filled with thoughts he tried to avoid. What if this was just another phase, a fleeting flicker? What if he was seeing meaning where there was none? He decided he needed to be sure. He asked the tech team to adjust the camera audio, improve the clarity, and archive all the files from the last week. It was as if he were looking for proof of something he already knew was real deep down, but still couldn't accept. The next night, he spent hours silently watching the footage. He saw Livia pull the wheelchair close to the bookshelf, open a children's book, and read with a gentle tone. Lucas reacted with his eyes, sometimes furrowing his brow, sometimes blinking faster. She narrated as if telling an important story, as if she were speaking to someone who understood every word. Eduardo pressed the pause button and let the remote fall onto the sofa. There was emotion there, a connection. This hit him, hard because he wasn't part of it. His son was reacting to a stranger, not to him. A woman who had been there for less than a month had accomplished something he had been trying to do for 2 years with the country's best specialists. It hurt. It touched a place he had kept locked since the day of the funeral. He stood up, went to the bar, and poured himself a glass of whiskey, but he didn't drink it. He just stood there, looking at the glass as if searching for answers in the bottom of the liquid. He didn't understand what he was feeling. It wasn't jealousy or anger, it was something deeper, a mix of guilt, admiration, and fear. The fear of believing again, the fear of losing once more. He still didn't know what he would do, but one thing was certain. Livia was awakening something he couldn't control. And Lucas was slowly coming back. And that changed everything. Friday started like any other. Eduardo woke up early, put on his custom-made shirt, checked his schedule on his tablet, and got into his car with his phone already pressed to his ear. He had important meetings at the office, 2 video calls with investors, and a business dinner scheduled for that night. The day was timed down to the minute, and he felt comfortable this way, immersed in commitments that kept him away from everything that hurt. At 11:40 a.m., when the second meeting of the day began to drag on longer than necessary, his secretary's phone rang. A logistical problem had cancelled was coming to close a partnership. Eduardo didn't react with anger. He just rubbed his face with his hand and asked them to rearrange his afternoon schedule. He was tired, more than he usually admitted. He took a deep breath and almost automatically asked the driver to take him home. On the way, he looked out the window at the cloudy sky of São Paulo and allowed himself a few minutes of silence. He wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about Lucas, since the night. Before, the image of his son following Livia's reading hadn't left his head. There was something in the way she communicated with him that challenged everything he believed was possible. And at the same time, it exposed him, showing how much he himself had withdrawn. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, Eduardo asked to enter alone. The driver looked surprised but obeyed. He walked with firm steps through the silent corridors. The house seemed empty, which was rare at that time of day. He went up to the second floor, where his office was, but decided not to go in. A very subtle sound coming from the glass-enclosed garden caught his attention. It was music, something soft, with an almost childlike rhythm. He frowned, not understanding. He followed the sound with silent steps, crossing the side hallway. As he got closer, the music became clearer. It was a cheerful, simple melody, one of those that remind you of school parties and kindergarten presentations, and along with it, something even more unexpected, a loud, spontaneous laugh, full of life. He stopped. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating. He hadn't heard Lucas laugh since before the accident. Eduardo approached the glass door of the winter garden and looked inside, unseen. The scene paralyzed him. Livia was slowly spinning Lucas's wheelchair in the center of the space, following the rhythm of the music playing on a small speaker on the table. She danced with a light step, her hair loose on the cold floor. Her movements were almost choreographed, as if she and the wheelchair were a single body. Lucas was in the center of the chair, his arms immobile, but his face was overflowing with expression. His eyes were shining, his mouth was open in a wide smile, and from it came gales of laughter, as if they had been trapped for a very long time. Eduardo couldn't bring himself to enter. He stood there, watching, as if invading that moment would break something sacred. He couldn't remember the last time he saw his son laugh. That sound was real, loud, alive, and there was so much beauty in that scene that his chest suddenly felt tight. He felt his legs waver slightly, as if his body wasn't ready for that impact. He leaned against the wall, trying to understand what he was feeling. For the next few minutes, he remained hidden there, while Livia and Lucas spun together with care and lightness. There was no rush, no technique, only presence. And there, in that simple spin, was a kind of reunion, something that no therapist, no specialist, and no sophisticated equipment had managed to provoke, something no machine could measure. When the music stopped, Livia wheeled the chair next to the window. Lucas was still smiling breathlessly, his cheeks flushed. She knelt beside him and said something softly that Eduardo couldn't hear, but he saw the boy slowly close his eyes, still smiling, as if he wanted to hold on to that joy for longer. Livia stayed there for a few seconds, then stood up, walked into the house, and disappeared from his sight. Eduardo still couldn't move. His chest was full of sensations he couldn't name: pride, pain, relief, guilt for not having done that, and gratitude that someone else had. When he finally entered the winter garden, Lucas was calmer, looking at the ceiling with a serene expression. Eduardo approached slowly, trying not to startle him. He sat in a chair next to the wheelchair in silence. Lucas didn't pull away either, but the father watched his son for a few minutes, trying to find something to say. Nothing came out. He didn't want to ruin the moment with the wrong words. He just placed his hand on the boy's immobile leg and took a deep breath. For the first time he felt he was in the presence of a miracle, and that this miracle had come through the hands of someone who didn't speak in terms of techniques, goals, or therapies. Someone who had simply been there every day, waiting for the right moment. Eduardo didn't know what to do with that feeling, but he knew he would never forget that music, that laugh, that instant. Something inside him had broken, something had begun to rebuild, and he knew that from now on, nothing would ever be the same. Eduardo woke up on Saturday before the sun rose. He had slept little, his thoughts occupying every inch of his mind. The image of Lucas smiling still lived within him like a moving photograph. It was hard to believe, and even harder to explain. For hours, the night before, he had wondered how it had happened, how a simple song and the touch of an unknown caregiver had accessed a place he, as a father, had never been able to reach. He spent the morning walking through the house in silence, noticing details he had previously ignored: the sound of the clock in the living room, the distant song of a thrush outside the kitchen window, the soft light streaming through the curtain cracks, things that had always been there but had seemed invisible until now. There was something different in the air, as if everything inside the mansion was being washed by a new breeze, still timid, but present. Near noon, he went down to the side balcony where Lucas had been spending time with Livia in recent days. He found the space empty, but saw the blanket carefully folded over the wicker armchair. He ran his fingers over the fabric and felt something hard to name, a kind of longing that didn't come from the past, but from something he felt was still to come. He stood there for a few minutes until he heard light footsteps coming from the hallway. Livia appeared with a notebook in her hands, ready to jot down the day's needs. When she saw Eduardo there, she stopped immediately. They were not used to meeting outside of formal moments. He watched her for a second, then pointed to the chair beside him, inviting her to sit. She hesitated but accepted, sitting with a firm posture, showing neither surprise nor embarrassment. She waited in silence. Eduardo took a long time to speak. He kept his eyes on the landscape ahead, as if he were still looking for courage in the trees in the garden. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than normal. "I saw." He paused. "I saw everything yesterday." Livia didn't move or widen her eyes. She just replied calmly, "I imagined you did." There was a brief silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with things that didn't yet have names. "I didn't know he could still laugh like that," Eduardo continued. "I didn't even remember the sound of his laugh anymore." Livia nodded slightly. She knew this was a fragile moment, that too many words could break what was forming. "He never forgot," she said at last. "He was just waiting for someone to hear him again." Eduardo swallowed hard. He felt a pang of guilt rise in his chest, along with something he didn't want to admit. Shame. Shame for having disappeared while his son was sinking. Shame for having trusted equipment more. And then affection. Shame for never having sat there exactly where he was now. "I hired the best," he said, more to himself than to her. And yet, this was all he needed. Livia looked at him gently, but without pity. She wasn't the type to diminish others' pain with soft words. He needed presence, someone who was there even without answers. What you gave him was structure, but he missed you. Eduardo lowered his eyes. There was no possible defense against that, and for the first time, he didn't want to defend himself. "I didn't know how to stay," he murmured. "Seeing him like that, it killed me inside, and I was already half dead." Livia said nothing. She knew this wasn't a common confession. It was the first step for a man who had long forgotten how to be a father. After a while, she stood up calmly. "He's in his room. He just had lunch. I can leave you alone if you want." Eduardo hesitated, looked at the floor for a few seconds, then raised his face and looked at her. "I don't know if he'll want to see me." "He always has," she replied with a firm voice. "He just didn't know how to call you back." He acknowledged her with a slight nod, stood up slowly, and walked to his son's room with his heart pounding. He stopped at the half-open door and saw Lucas looking toward the window, where a ray of sun was shining through the glass. The boy was serene. There was a tranquility in his expression that he hadn't seen in years. Eduardo entered without making a sound, pulled up a chair, and sat next to the wheelchair. For a time he said nothing, just stayed there. Then he reached out and carefully placed his hand on Lucas's hand. It was warm, soft, alive. "Son," he whispered, not knowing what would come next. "I'm sorry." Lucas didn't respond or turn his face, but his hand made a slight movement. His fingers, which had been still, squeezed his father's hand with minimal force. Eduardo closed his eyes, and a tear slid down his face, silently. Something he had never truly felt in the last 2 years. From hope. He didn't know what would happen from that moment on, but in that small gesture, in that silent exchange, was the beginning of something he was no longer willing to lose. That afternoon seemed longer than usual. Eduardo walked through the rooms of the house like someone looking for something they don't know they've lost. His steps were slow, his mind full. Since the morning, the touch of Lucas's hand hadn't left his thoughts. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but so intense that it had shaken everything within him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he wasn't alone inside his own house. At the end of the day, he decided to look for Livia. He needed to talk to her, to look into the eyes of this woman who, in a few short weeks, had done more for his son than he had done in 2 years. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table, organizing a box of medicine bottles and labels. Eduardo in the doorway. She didn't stand up, just continued what she was doing, her gaze focused on the task at hand. "Could you come with me?" he asked in a low but firm voice. Livia nodded and carefully closed the box before standing up. They walked in silence to the living room. Eduardo gestured to one of the sofas and waited for her to sit down. He stood for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. He needed courage to ask questions he might not be ready to hear. "I wanted to know," stopping in the middle of the sentence. He ran a hand through his hair and started again. "How did you make him laugh?" Livia looked at him without wavering. "I didn't," she replied calmly. "I was just there. That's it." Eduardo frowned. The simplicity of her answer disarmed him. "It can't be just that," he insisted. He laughed out loud. He looked at me today with his old eyes. He held my hand after 2 years. That doesn't happen by chance." Livia took a deep breath, crossed her arms over her lap, and maintained her serene tone. "I didn't force anything, and I didn't expect anything. I was just close to him with patience. I gave him time, I gave him space, and when he wanted to show me something, I was watching." Eduardo sat down, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor. He was shaken, not by anger, but by a deep discomfort. The pain of realizing what he had lost, what he had ignored, what he had refused to see. He felt small, and that didn't fit with the businessman he had built himself to be. "Do you believe he'll talk again?" he asked in a softer tone. "I believe he's still here," she said. "There's a lot inside him waiting to get out, but it won't come out with pressure. It will come out when he feels safe." Eduardo nodded slowly. They were silent for a few moments. Then he stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the garden and continued to speak without turning around. "I was afraid to get close, afraid to look at him and see the guilt there. I was driving that night, it was too fast. Mariana tried to shield him with her body. When I got out of the car, she was still breathing. He was too. And I just stood there, frozen in the middle of the street, unable to even pick up my own son." Livia listened without interrupting. She felt that these words had been held in for a very long time. "When he came back from the hospital, I wanted to turn everything into efficiency. I hired the best. I created a bubble of care. I put an army around him, but I was never the one who was there. I gave him everything except what he needed." He turned to her, his eyes red, not with anger, but with the look of someone who was, for the first time, allowing their pain to become visible. "Then you arrived without a speech, without promising miracles, and he woke up because of you." Livia didn't look away, but there was something in her face that wasn't pride, a kind of silent respect that neither apologized nor offered forgiveness. It just recognized what was being said. "It wasn't because of me," she corrected softly. "It was because of him. He wanted to come back. He chose to show himself." Eduardo sat down again and rubbed his hands together hard. "I don't know how to move forward with this. I'm afraid to get close and have him regress. I'm afraid of being a stranger in my own son's life." "Then stay," she replied. "Even if you're afraid. Stay. Sit next to him. Wait. His time will tell you what to do." Looked up at her. For the first time, he saw in this woman not just a caregiver, but a bridge, a path he didn't know how to walk alone. "Thank you," he said in a whisper. Livia simply nodded, then stood up, straightened her blouse, and walked toward the hallway. Before leaving, she stopped at the door. "Tonight, if you want, you can play that music, the one from the garden. I saved it on his tablet. I think he'd like to hear it with you." Eduardo watched as she disappeared down the hallway. Night, for the first time, he would enter his son's room, not as a businessman, not as someone who needed to control everything, but as a father. And that changed everything. Night fell silently on the mansion. Outside, the city seemed distant, muffled by thick windows and well-kept gardens. Inside, all was quiet, except for a room on the second floor where a soft light warmed the white walls. Eduardo stood before Lucas's door, the tablet in his hands, hesitating. He had spent the entire day thinking about his conversation with Livia. Her words resonated within him powerfully. "Stay, even if you're afraid." That's what she had said, and that's what he decided to do. He took a deep breath, adjusted the tablet in his lap, and carefully pushed the door open. Lucas was awake. His eyes were turned toward the ceiling, as if he were waiting for something. Eduardo approached in silence, pulled up a chair, and sat next to the bed. For a moment, he just watched his son, the pale skin, the watchful eyes, the immobile body, but what stood out most was the presence. Lucas was there, whole in silence, but whole. "Hi, son," Eduardo said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Livia told me you like this music. I brought it here." He turned on the tablet and found the file she had saved. The music began to play, a sweet melody of guitar and gentle sounds, like the ones Mariana used to play on Friday nights. Eduardo felt his heart clench. It was like stepping back in time. But now it was, because now he was there, not as a spectator, but as someone willing to participate. Lucas slowly turned his eyes toward the sound. Eduardo noticed. The boy had acknowledged him and didn't look away. That was enough for Eduardo to move a little closer. "Do you remember this music? Your mom loved it. We used to dance with you in our arms, remember?" Lucas didn't respond, but there was a moist shine in his eyes. Eduardo felt his throat close up. He made an effort not to fall into the hole where he always hid. He stayed silent for a few seconds, just listening to the music with him. Then he reached out and touched his son's arm gently. "I messed up so much, son. I stayed too far away. I tried to fix everything my way, without even asking how you were feeling. I'm sorry." Lucas blinked slowly. Then, with a slight movement, he rested the side of his head against the support of the chair, turning a little more toward his father. Eduardo interpreted this as permission, taking the boy's hand in his own and enveloping it gently. The music continued. In the background, the notes seemed to float inside the room, filling the empty spaces with memories that still hurt, but were now beginning to heal. Eduardo lowered his eyes, feeling the warmth of his son's hand for the first time without fear. When he looked at Lucas again, he noticed the boy's lips were slightly parted. It was instinctive. He leaned in as if listening to a secret. "Do you want to say something?" Lucas took a deep breath. The sound that came out was weak, rough, like a whisper that didn't know how to be a voice, but there was a word there, clear enough to cut through any silence. "Dad!" Eduardo froze, his eyes filled with tears. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, but Lucas was looking at him with a steady gaze, and although the sound was fragile, it was real. A single word, small, but as heavy as the world. "You spoke," he said, his voice choked. "My God, you spoke." He leaned in and rested, his forehead against his son's, too emotional to say anything else. The tears flowed freely. He no longer wanted to hide them. In that room, once filled with painful silence, there was now something different. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. It was life. After a while, Eduardo turned off the tablet but stayed there. He no longer needed music. Lucas was calm, his eyes slowly closing, his breathing steady. Before leaving, the father adjusted the blanket over him and watched for a few more seconds. When he left the room, he found Livia in the hallway, standing discreetly, as if she didn't want to intrude. "He spoke," Eduardo said, his voice still trembling. Livia smiled without surprise. "I knew he'd choose the right time." He approached and hugged her, a gesture that didn't come from an employer, but from someone who recognized the importance of the person who had been present when he hadn't known how to be. "Thank you," he murmured. "He did that for you," she replied. "He just needed to know you were there." Eduardo looked at the room again before going downstairs. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel the house was empty, or himself. He didn't know what the future held, but now he had something that couldn't be bought or built in a hurry. He had back the most important sound a father can hear. A single word, Dad.